Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a seriously fascinating and honestly deeply complex scenario to unpack today from our source documents. And we're not just going to look at this as your standard legal case. Instead, we're diving into the profound psychological disconnect between a highly analytical individual's mind and a rigidly structured legal system. By the end of this, you'll see not just how this specific case played out, but really why human beings and massive institutions so often completely miss each other. Let's get into it. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to breeze through 6 key areas. We'll start with 2 clashing cognitive systems, move into processing information and beliefs, look at the motivation behind action, touch on emotion, meaning, and resilience, examine the psychology of institutions, and wrap up with when different minds collide. All right, Section 1, 2 clashing cognitive systems. Let's take a macro view of this conflict. To ground us in the facts from the source material, we have Dr. Chen Jingyuan. He's an academic who was charged with the crime of picking quarrels and provoking trouble. Now, the core action that actually led to this charge was simply him forwarding various posts on social media. But if we look at this objectively, the sources suggest that the resulting legal battle was really a symptom of a much deeper, systemic cognitive mismatch between the defendant and the prosecution. And here's that fundamental clash. On one side, you have the individual, Dr. Chen, operating under what we call an open cognitive system. This basically means he tolerates high uncertainty, he looks at things as probabilities rather than absolute facts, and he's constantly exploring multiple perspectives. But then, on the flip side, you have the judicial institution operating as a closed cognitive system. It is highly risk-averse, it requires binary judgments like, guilty or not guilty, and it absolutely demands certainty. In psychology, this mismatch plays out across a few key dimensions. You've got the individual's cognitive flexibility directly colliding with the institution's cognitive rigidity. You have epistemic motivation, which is honestly just a fancy term for wanting to figure out how the world works, clashing hard with the institution's drive for norm enforcement and maintaining order. And finally, the individual operates on mastery goals, learning just for learning's sake, while the institution operates on performance goals. It needs a concrete output, like closing a case or securing a conviction. Moving on to Section 2, processing information and beliefs. Let's look at this through the lens of cognitive psychology. Think about this for a second. How do you actually process complex, contradictory information when you're just, say, scrolling online? Do you immediately decide if something is the absolute truth or a total lie? Well, according to the information processing model, it happens in 3 distinct steps. First up is perception. That's when you encounter highly uncertain information. Second is interpretation. Now, for an academic like Dr. Chen, this involves applying that cognitive flexibility we talked about, keeping multiple possibilities open. And third is the decision. In this specific context, forwarding a post isn't necessarily an endorsement of its absolute truth. It's more of an epistemic action. It's kind of like bookmarking a bizarre article to read later. It definitely doesn't mean you automatically agree with the headline. Which brings us to a massive legal and psychological hurdle. What exactly constitutes knowing? Because in law, proving mens rea or deliberate intent requires showing the person actually knew the information was false. But cognitive psychology introduces this really interesting concept called the need for cognitive closure. This is basically our psychological desire to quickly reach a definitive answer just to avoid ambiguity. The sources highlight that Dr. Chen has a very low need for cognitive closure. He comfortably and fluidly navigates that gray area of not knowing if a post is 100% true or false. The judicial system, however, it has an extremely high need for cognitive closure. It looks at the action of forwarding a post and, being entirely unable to process that gray area, immediately categorizes it as a definitive knowing endorsement. Okay, Section 3, the motivation behind action. Let's pivot and look at motivation psychology. Notice the stark difference in what gets these 2 entities out of bed in the morning. The individual is driven by intrinsic motivation, so autonomy, competence, and a goal of knowledge exploration. The institution, though, relies entirely on extrinsic motivation. Its goals are external, enforcing norms, reducing societal risk, and establishing order. They are quite literally playing 2 completely different games on the exact same board. So when these 2 very different motivational systems interact, how does one judge the intent of the other? Usually with a whole lot of errors. The crucial point here is a psychological trap known as the fundamental attribution error. It's like when someone cuts you off in traffic, right? You immediately assume they're a terrible person. That's their internal motive, completely ignoring that they might be rushing to the hospital, which is the external factor. The institutional system falls right into this trap. It looks at a chaotic online environment filled with ambiguous data, completely ignores that context, and attributes the forwarding of a post entirely to the individual's supposed malicious internal intent. Moving into Section 4, Emotion, Meaning, and Resilience, from the perspective of emotional psychology. The source materials reveal a truly fascinating profile of emotional regulation here. Dr. Chen didn't emotionally collapse under pressure. Instead, he used advanced psychological strategies. First, cognitive reappraisal, which meant framing his legal trouble not as a personal crisis, but as an objective scientific conflict. Second, intellectualization. He turned the suffering of confinement into a theoretical analysis of the system itself. And finally, meaning-making, an approach super similar to Viktor Frankl's theories, where he viewed his experience not as pointless, but as creating a historical record for the future. And this is exactly what allowed him to maintain total self-consistency. This leads to a really powerful reflection from the psychological analysis of the case. Understanding human error is the first step to protecting humanity. This perfectly underscores the necessity for psychological maturity in our systems. It advocates for actually understanding the mechanics of human cognition rather than just defaulting to punitive action the second someone doesn't fit the mold. All right, Section 5, the psychology of institutions. Let's unpack the systemic mind. How does a collective group of people forming a massive institution actually make judgments? Does a system have its own personality? Well, yes, it actually does. Institutional errors aren't necessarily born out of deliberate malice, but very often out of cognitive overload and a structural drive for systemic order. Just look at the mechanisms at play here. You have confirmation bias, where the system naturally selects evidence that only supports a predetermined narrative of guilt. There's the conformity effects, where individuals within the system avoid speaking out due to group pressure. And threat perception bias, where a rigid system automatically amplifies highly ambiguous, complex information into a perception of systemic hostility. And finally, Section 6. When different minds collide, let's synthesize our findings. So here is the ultimate mismatch summarized. On one side, we have the expert cognitive model, freely analyzing the world through probabilities, navigating complex networks, and looking at structural causality. On the totally opposing side, we have the institutional model, strictly demanding binary, guilty or not guilty outcomes, relying heavily on intuitive past experience, and enforcing strict linear causality, A equals B. According to the psychological frameworks in the source material, the crux of this case isn't just a simple legal debate over facts. It is fundamentally a system mistaking an individual's low-certainty cognitive exploration, a guy just trying to learn and categorize complex information, for high-certainty dissemination. From a purely psychological standpoint, the institution reacts defensively to cognitive diversity simply because it lacks the structural capacity to process it. I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. If our legal institutions are psychologically wired to demand absolute binary certainty in a human world that is fundamentally defined by psychological ambiguity and uncertainty, how can true justice ever be served? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll see you next time.